The gun was already pressed to Edwin Crawford's temple when Mae Shepard walked through the saloon doors and said, "Oh good, you found him. I have been looking everywhere for this man." Every head in the Dead Spur saloon swiveled toward her. The man holding the gun, a thick-necked bounty hunter named Cassius Vole, did not lower his weapon, but his eyes slid sideways with the involuntary reflex of someone who has just heard something so absurd they cannot help themselves. Edwin Crawford, for his part, went very still in the way that a man goes still when he is calculating distances, exit angles, and the precise weight of the trigger finger currently resting against his fate. Mae Shepard walked straight to the bar as though there were no gun in the room at all. She set her carpetbag on the counter with a decisive thump, pulled off her traveling gloves one finger at a time, and said to the bartender, "I will have a glass of water, please, if you have such a thing in this town. The dust on that road is simply extraordinary." "Lady," Cassius Vole said slowly, "you need to step back." "I absolutely will," Mae said cheerfully, accepting her water glass and turning around to face the room. "Just as soon as you tell me what my husband owes you, because I am certain we can settle this like civilized people, and I, for one, am very tired of traveling." The word husband landed in the saloon like a stone dropped in still water. Rings spread outward from it. Edwin Crawford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had never seen this woman before in his life. He was certain of that because he had a very good memory for faces, and the face currently looking at Cassius Vole with pleasant, implacable calm was not one he would have forgotten. "Your husband," Vole repeated, "is worth $400 dead or alive on account of 3 counts of horse theft, and a matter in Laredo that the sheriff there takes real personal." "Horse theft," Mae said, with exactly the tone a schoolteacher uses when a student has gotten a sum dramatically wrong. "You have mistaken my husband for someone else. Edwin here has not stolen a horse in his life. He owns horses. We have a ranch just outside of Redemption, and the reason he is sitting in this establishment on a Wednesday morning is that I sent him to purchase supply invoices from the land office, which closed early, as land offices are prone to do, and now here we both are." She paused. "Is there a land office in this town? I have not had a chance to look around." There was a beat of silence that stretched until it nearly snapped. Then Cassius Vole made his first real mistake of the morning. He looked at Edwin Crawford and said, "This your wife?" And Edwin Crawford, whose dark eyes had not left Mae Shepard's face since she walked through those doors, said, "Yes." Vole lowered the gun 2 inches. That was all Edwin needed. He moved so fast that several of the onlookers later swore they had not seen it happen. One moment there was a gun at a man's head, and the next Cassius Vole was sitting on the floor with his wrist bent at an uncomfortable angle, and the gun was gone. Edwin Crawford straightened his coat, picked up his hat from where it had fallen during the original scuffle, and walked to the bar. He stood next to Mae Shepard and said, very quietly, so that only she could hear, "I don't know what your game is, but we are leaving this building right now, and you are going to keep walking until I say stop." "Of course," Mae said agreeably, and picked up her carpetbag. "Could someone see to my horse out front? She has been standing in the sun for 20 minutes and she is very particular about shade." They walked out of the Dead Spur saloon into the bright, merciless Arizona sunshine of September 1882, and Edwin Crawford kept walking until they were behind the livery stable, and then he turned around. "Who are you?" he said. It was not a question. It had no lift at the end. It was the flat kind of statement a man makes when he is dangerously close to the edge of his patience. "Mae Shepard," she said, extending her hand. "Though I suppose for the next little while it might be better if people think it's me Crawford." "It's not going to be anything," Edwin said, "because you are going to tell me exactly what you want, and then you are going to walk away from me, and we are never going to see each other again." Mae looked at him steadily. She was 26 years old, with light brown hair that the wind had already done considerable damage to, and eyes the color of creek water in October, somewhere between green and gray, and not quite committing to either. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the street, but there was something in her face that made you keep looking, the same way you kept looking at a piece of writing that seemed to mean more than the words on the page. I understand you feel that way, she said, and I respect it, but I need your help, Mr. Crawford, and I think you need mine, and I am willing to pay quite fairly for the arrangement. I told you, Edwin said, I have no use for conversation. Mae Shepard looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, the way a person shifts their grip on a tool when they realize the job is harder than expected. All right, she said. Then I will talk and you can just listen. She talked for 3 hours. By the end of the first hour, Edwin had stopped trying to leave. By the end of the second, he had sat down on an overturned feed trough. By the end of the third, he had said 8 words, not because he had forgotten that he had no use for conversation exactly, but because something about the way Mae Shepard talked made silence feel like a room he was choosing to sit in rather than a wall he was hiding behind. And that was the beginning. To understand how Edwin Crawford came to be sitting in a saloon in Copper Flat, Arizona with a gun at his head on a Wednesday morning, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to the moment he rode into the town of Redemption with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, a rifle that had seen better decades, and a reputation for being the best tracker in the territory, and the absolute worst conversationalist anyone had ever had the misfortune of needing information from. Redemption was a town that had been named by someone who believed in second chances, and then abandoned by most of the people who did not. It sat in a dry valley between 2 red rock ridges, like something a child had set down and forgot to pick up. There was a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office 3 days a week, a church that had services every other Sunday, a saloon that had no such breaks, a land office that kept its own schedule, and about 400 people trying to make something out of the hard, unforgiving ground. Edwin Crawford had been to Redemption twice before. The first time was when he was 19 and passing through on a job that did not end well and that he did not think about anymore. The second time was 2 years ago, when he tracked a stolen cattle herd back to a ranch 3 miles outside of town and was paid in cash and left without speaking to anyone who was not directly involved in the transaction. He came back this third time because Hector Milligan had written him a letter. Hector Milligan ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, a spread called the Double M that had been his father's before him and would, in theory, be his son's after him. Hector had 2 sons. They were both, by various accounts Edwin had heard, absolute disasters, but Hector loved them in the way fathers love difficult things, stubbornly and without much apparent awareness of the reality in front of him. The letter said there was work. It said the pay was good. It said Edwin's particular skills were required. It did not say for what, because Hector Milligan had learned from the last tracker he had hired that some things were better discussed in person. Edwin arrived on a Thursday in late July, when the heat was the kind that made the ground shimmer and the horses miserable. He tied his horse at the post outside the Hotel Redemption had a hotel, a 4-room affair above the general store, and walked to Milligan's office, which was attached to the Double M's town headquarters, a low adobe building near the land office. Hector Milligan was a wide man in his late 50s with a white mustache and the kind of sunburn that had long since become permanent. He shook Edwin's hand and poured whiskey without asking if Edwin wanted any and said, "I need someone found." "Who?" Edwin said. "My niece," Milligan said. "Technically, her name is Mae Shepard, daughter of my wife's sister, God rest her. Mae's father died last winter. He was a doctor over in Prescott. Left her the house and some debts and not much else. I wrote her in April, told her to come to Redemption, told her she could stay with us, help my wife with the household, find herself a husband from among the decent men in the valley. Practical solution." "Where is she?" Edwin said. Milligan's mustache moved in a way that suggested he was choosing his words. "That," he said, "is the question. She wrote back, said she was coming, said she would arrive in Redemption by the 10th of June. It is now July. She has not arrived." Edwin looked at the whiskey glass he had not touched. "Could have changed her mind." "Could have," Milligan said. Except that 2 weeks ago I got a letter from a woman in Flagstaff who said she'd seen a young woman matching me's description asking for directions to Redemption, asked specifically about the road through the canyon. Edwin looked up. The canyon road. Yes, Milligan's jaw tightened. And you know as well as I do what's been happening on the canyon road. Edwin knew. The canyon road was the fastest route between Flagstaff and Redemption, and for the past 3 months it had been contested territory. There was a man named Dylan Rourke who had decided that the land on either side of the canyon land that had previously been considered a common thoroughfare was actually his by right of a deed. He claimed to have purchased from a man who had purchased it from the original territory grant. Whether the deed was real or forged was a matter currently before the territorial court in Tucson, but while the court was deliberating, Dylan Rourke was collecting tolls. And when people did not pay the tolls, things happened to them that Rourke's men called accidents. "You think she went through the canyon," Edwin said. "I think she might have," Milligan said. "And I think if she did, one of two things happened. Either Rourke's men turned her back, in which case she is somewhere between here and Flagstaff and I need to know where, or something worse happened and I need to know that too." Edwin looked at the whiskey again. He picked it up and drank it this time. "Pay is $200, Milligan said. "Half now, half when you find her and bring her here." "If she's alive," Edwin said. "If she's alive," Milligan agreed. Edwin took the job. He took the $100 and he rode east the next morning before the sun was fully up, following the road toward Flagstaff, looking for a woman he had never met. What he found, after 4 days of careful tracking and 2 conversations that cost him considerable effort, was that Mae Shepard had not, in fact, gone through the canyon. She had taken the longer road around the southern route that added 3 days to the journey, because she had been warned about the canyon by a freight driver she met in Flagstaff. She had then, through a combination of bad luck, a thrown horseshoe, and what appeared to be spectacularly poor navigation, ended up about 60 miles south of Redemption in a town called Copper Flat, where she had been staying for 2 weeks while she tried to figure out what had gone wrong with her compass. The problem was that Copper Flat was also where Cassius Vole had tracked Edwin Crawford, because Cassius Vole had very good information, and Edwin Crawford had made the mistake of signing his real name in the hotel register. So that was the Wednesday morning. That was the gun. That was Mae Shepard walking through the saloon doors and saying the wrong thing in exactly the right way. Behind the livery stable, in the shade of a wall that smelled of hay and horse, Mae Shepard told Edwin Crawford the rest of it. Her father's debts, she explained, were not simple debts. Dr. Thomas Shepard had borrowed money, a significant amount, from a man named Garrett Pope, who operated out of Tucson and who had interests in various enterprises that were not entirely legal and not entirely not. When Thomas Shepard died in January, Garrett Pope sent a representative to Prescott to inform me that the debt had transferred to her, as sole heir, per a document her father had signed that she had not known about. "How much?" Edwin said. He had not meant to speak. The question came out before he had properly decided to ask it. Mae looked at him as though she was aware of the significance of this, the first crack in the wall, but was smart enough not to acknowledge it directly. $1,100, she said, which is, as you might imagine, rather more than a doctor's daughter in Prescott typically has access to. "And Pope," Edwin said, "is not a patient man," Mae said. "I have had 3 messages from him since January. The first said he expected payment within 6 months. The second said he expected it within 3. The third, which arrived 2 weeks ago while I was already in Copper Flat trying to figure out where I had gone wrong with my navigation, said he would be sending someone to collect." "Collect what?" Edwin said, though he had a feeling he already knew. "He has a contract," Mae said flatly, "with a man in Colorado. A man who buys contracts on women." The silence that followed that sentence was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind with sharp edges. "My uncle has money," Mae said, and her voice was steady, which Edwin recognized from the way he recognized it in himself, as the steadiness of someone who has already cried about something and moved on to the practical stage. If I can get to redemption, if I can explain the situation to Hector, he can help me deal with Pope. I know he can. But I cannot get to redemption by myself. I have tried twice, and I end up somewhere I did not intend to be, and I am running out of time. Edwin looked at her for a long time. You could hire a guide in Copper Flat. I did, Mae said. He took my money and pointed me south and rode north himself, which is how I met the gentleman at the land office here who told me a man named Edwin Crawford was in town, and that Edwin Crawford was reportedly the best tracker in the territory. He's also reportedly wanted in 3 counties, Edwin said. The Cassius Vole situation, Mae said, and waved a hand slightly. Is that going to be a continuing problem? Probably not in Copper Flat, Edwin said. Vole doesn't work for free and I cost him money today. Then he will try again somewhere else. Most likely. Mae looked at him with those Creekwater eyes and said, So we both have reasons to move quickly. I need to get to redemption. You need to not be in a town where Cassius Vole's wrist is only slightly injured and his pride is significantly worse. She paused. I told you I would pay fairly. I have $40 left, which I recognize is not a great deal of money, but my uncle will pay you when we arrive. I know he will. Edwin thought about the $100 already in his pocket. He thought about Hector Milligan, and the second 100 he would earn for delivering Mae Shepard safely to redemption. He thought about the fact that the most logical thing to do had been obvious for the last 3 hours and that the conversation had, despite himself, been something other than the torture he expected. I don't talk, he said. While we travel, I don't make small talk, I don't discuss the scenery. I understand, Mae said. I mean it. I believe you mean it, she said. I am simply not sure it will work out the way you are envisioning. He stared at her. She looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who has said a true thing and is simply waiting for the truth to arrive in its own time. We leave at dawn, Edwin said. We travel the canyon road. I thought you said that road was dangerous. It is, he said, but it's faster and the woman who told you to avoid it didn't know about the passage around the south wall. Rourke's men don't watch that way because most people don't know it exists. And you know it exists. I tracked a man through it 2 years ago, Mae nodded thoughtfully. And the Cassius Vole bounty, the 3 counties, the Laredo matter, I do not know what the Laredo matter is, but I assume it is something I should not ask about. It is, Edwin said. Then I will not ask about it, Mae said. Tonight, probably. He looked at her again. The feeling was strange, like a door in a house he had believed completely boarded up, moving slightly in a wind he had not noticed until just now. Hotel is on the north end of town, he said. Get your things together. Be ready to ride by 4 in the morning. He walked away before she could say anything else, which was, he told himself, purely a tactical decision. The morning was cold in the way desert mornings are cold deeply, suddenly, as if the temperature had somewhere urgent to be before the sun arrived to warm it. Mae was standing outside the hotel at 10 minutes before 4 with her carpet bag, her horse, a brown mare of middling height and extremely good temperament that Mae had named Patience, and a wrapped bundle that turned out, when Edwin looked at it, to contain a considerable quantity of food. There is hardtack, some dried beef, 3 apples, cornbread, and a tin of peaches, Mae informed him. The woman at the boarding house where I was staying felt guilty about my situation, and cooking is how she expresses guilt. Also 2 slices of apple pie, but those will not last past noon, so I thought we might eat them for breakfast. Edwin looked at the bundle. He looked at the pie. He was not categorically a man who was moved by pie. The peaches, he said, are going to be noisy on horseback. I wedged them between the cornbread and the hardtack, Mae said. I thought of that. He looked at her in the dark for a moment, then turned and mounted his horse, a black gelding named Nothing, because Edwin Crawford did not name horses, a personal policy he held to with the same conviction he held to not talking, and started down the road. Mae fell in behind him on Patience and for approximately 4 minutes said nothing. Then she said, "The stars here are really something, aren't they?" Edwin kept riding. I grew up in Prescott, Mae continued, apparently unbothered by the silence ahead of her. which has its share of stars, but the sky feels lower there somehow, like it's pressed down by the mountains. Out here it goes on in a way that makes you feel very small. I don't mean that as a complaint. I find it rather wonderful, actually. Have you always lived in open country? Edwin kept writing. I ask because you seem like someone who has. There's a way people carry themselves when they've been under big sky for a long time. A certain quality in how they move. You have it. My father had the opposite. He was very much a town person, indoors, books, coffee in the mornings. He loved coffee. I do too. I miss it terribly, actually. There was no coffee in Copper Flat that I could find, only something called coffee that I think was made from beans that had a personal grudge against the people consuming them. The road curved east. Edwin could see the first pale lightening of the horizon ahead, the edge of the dark pulling back. You don't have to respond, Mae said. I'm aware of that. I'm not talking because I expect you to talk back. I'm talking because I think out loud. I always have. My father used to say that being in a room with me was like having access to a very disorganized but occasionally useful library. You never knew what subject was going to come up, but if you needed something, it was probably in there somewhere. The dark made it easier somehow. Edwin could not have explained that if pressed. The dark and the hoofbeats and the distance between them, Mae was riding about 6 feet behind him. Giving him room meant that her voice was something he could choose to hear or not hear, except that he kept hearing it. Are you from Arizona originally? She asked. Silence. Or Texas? You have some Texas in your speech, not a lot but a little around the edges. Edwin turned slightly in the saddle. He was not going to respond. He was absolutely not going to respond. Kansas, he said. Mae received this the way you receive a gift that is smaller than expected but still genuinely appreciated, without excessive reaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that it has arrived. Kansas, she repeated thoughtfully. Which part? He turned back to face the road. South. Near the Indian Territory border. Near enough. That's interesting, Mae said, and he could hear her genuinely meaning it. My father treated patients who'd come up from that border country. He said the land did something particular to people, made them very capable and very lonely at the same time. Edwin said nothing to that, but the sentence settled somewhere in him that he did not examine carefully. They rode through the morning. As the sun climbed, the desert came into the kind of beauty it reserved for early hours, the rocks going copper and amber, the long shadows shortening, the air carrying the smell of sage and something dry and mineral that was purely itself and could not be described as anything else. Mae observed it all, and some of it she kept to herself, and some of it she said aloud, not always as though she expected an answer, but as though thinking was a physical thing that needed to exit her somewhere. At mid-morning she said, "Can I ask about the bounty? Not the Laredo matter, I promised I wouldn't. But the horse theft, because I told Cassius Vole you did not steal horses, and I would prefer not to have told a lie on your behalf that I could have made slightly more accurate." Edwin was quiet for a moment. The terrain had changed. They were moving toward the canyon now, the red walls rising on either side of a narrowing passage, the shadow deep and sudden after the open sun. The horses weren't stolen, he said finally. The man who reported them stolen had acquired them from a man who owed money. The man who owed money had borrowed them from a ranching concern near Socorro that he worked for. When I tracked the horses, I returned them to Socorro. The man who had wanted them back out of the deal filed the theft report out of spite. Mae digested this. So you were hired to track the horses, and then the person who hired you turned on you. Essentially. That seems like a significant betrayal, Mae said, for someone who trusted you with a job. Yes, Edwin said, and the word was quiet and flat in a way that Mae, being perceptive in the way she was perceptive, filed away without comment. The canyon road opened into the passage he knew, a narrow ledge behind an outcropping that Rourke's men, watching the main road from above, could not see from their position. Edwin slowed his horse to a careful walk and held up a hand. Mae stopped immediately, which surprised him. He had expected her to have to be told twice. He turned to look at her. She was reading the terrain with the same focus she gave everything else, and she had gone very quiet in the way people go quiet when they understand the situation has changed. "We move single file," he said, barely above a murmur. "Quietly. No talking." She nodded. They moved through the passage in silence. The walls pressed close. Edwin's left knee nearly brushed the rock face. Above them, some distance away and out of sight, he could hear the faint sound of men talking, the clink of something metal. Rourke's toll station was on the main road, 50 feet above and to the north. Invisible to each other, separated by 3 inches of good fortune and Edwin Crawford's memory of a route most people did not know. Me's horse patience made no sound. Me made no sound. Edwin kept his breathing slow and steady and moved his horse forward with the patience that long tracking work had taught him. You moved at the speed the situation required, not the speed you wanted to move. The passage took 12 minutes to clear. When they emerged on the other side, into the widening valley beyond the canyon, Me let out a breath so quietly it was almost not a breath at all. They rode another mile before Edwin slowed to a normal pace. "That was remarkable," Me said, in a tone that was hushed not with fear but with something close to awe. "How did you know about that passage?" "Tracked a man through it in 1880, he said. "He thought no one knew it. He was almost right." "Almost," Me said. "You caught him." "Yes." "What had he done?" "Killed a man in Albuquerque and took his land deed," Edwin said. "The man's family hired me." Me was quiet for a moment. "You do that a lot, work for families," Edwin considered. "Some. It seems like righteous work," Me said, "even if people misunderstand it." He looked at her sideways. She was watching the road ahead, her hair coming loose from its pins in the morning heat, her posture straight but relaxed on Patience's back. She rode well. He had noticed that already but noticed it again. "Most people don't call it that," he said. "Most people have not thought about it carefully," Me said simply. They stopped at noon in the shade of a stand of cottonwood trees near a shallow creek that Edwin knew held water even in late summer. Me unpacked the food with the efficiency of someone who had been doing practical things, without assistance for long enough that it had become natural. She handed Edwin his share without asking what he wanted, which was correct hardtack, dried beef, and apple. She ate the pie first. "Life philosophy," she said, catching his expression, which was not exactly a look but was something adjacent to one. "Eat the perishable things first. It applies broadly." "Broadly," Edwin repeated. "Yes, don't save the good things for later. Later doesn't always arrive when you expect it." She paused, then added more quietly, "My father taught me that." In his actual words, it was about pie, but I have found it applies to most things. Edwin ate his apple and said nothing, but the sentence stayed with him in the same way the other one had, doing something quiet and stubborn inside a place he kept closed. "Can I ask how old you are?" Me said. "I am 26. You don't have to answer." 31, Edwin said. "That's a good age," Me said. "You're old enough to know things, but young enough that the knowing hasn't made you tired yet." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Or maybe it has, I am not sure. You're difficult to read." "People say that," Edwin said. "Do they bother you, people who say things about you?" "No." "Good," Me said. "Because I have said several things about you in the last several hours, and I would prefer you not to be bothered by them." She looked at him over her apple core. "I think you are very capable, and I think something happened to you that made you decide that connection was a liability. And I think you are wrong about that, but I also understand why you arrived at that conclusion, and I am not going to push you." The silence that followed was the most interesting silence Edwin Crawford had sat in for years. It had layers to it. It had weight and also somehow a kind of air. "You don't know anything about me," he said finally. "I know you told a man who was actively dangerous that I was your wife without a moment of visible hesitation, to protect a woman you had never met," Me said. "That is not nothing. It was a tactical decision. It was also a kind one," Me said. "You could have had me dragged out of the way and dealt with Vole differently. You chose not to. I noticed." Edwin got up and went to water his horse, which was the most useful thing he could do with himself in that moment. They made camp that night at the edge of a dry wash, 20 miles from Redemption. Edwin built a fire for heat. The desert cold had come early this evening, and Mee produced the tin of peaches, which were, in fact, not as noisy as he had predicted because she had indeed wedged them effectively. She opened the tin with a folding knife she took from her carpet bag, and for a while they sat on opposite sides of the fire and passed the tin back and forth without speaking, and it was the most natural thing Edwin Crawford had done with another person in a very long time, which he found troubling. "Tell me something true," Mee said out of nowhere. She was looking into the fire. "About what?" Edwin said. "About anything, about yourself, something you know to be real." Edwin looked at the fire for a while. It was the kind of request that he would have walked away from in any other conversation, under any other sky, beside any other fire. He had no idea why he answered. "I track people," he said slowly, "and I'm good at it. And sometimes I find them and they're not what the person who hired me thought they were, and sometimes what the person who hired me does with that information is not what I would have chosen. And I've had to sit with that." He paused. "That's true." Mee was quiet, listening in the full way that she listened, not waiting for a pause to speak, but actually receiving what was said. "That sounds like a heavy thing to carry," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you carry it alone." "I've always carried things alone," Edwin said. "It's cleaner." "Cleaner," Mee repeated, as though she was turning the word over and looking at its underside. "That's an interesting word for it. I would say lonelier." "Lonelier is also true," Edwin said, and was immediately surprised that he had said it. Mee looked at him across the fire, and something in her expression was careful in the way people are careful with things that are fragile and worth protecting. "You don't have to be," she said. "That's not a declaration. I'm not being dramatic. I just mean it as a statement of fact. You don't have to be." Edwin looked at the fire. The peaches were good. The stars above were extraordinary, and he had known they were extraordinary for years, but tonight, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, he was aware of seeing them. He fell asleep watching them and woke before dawn with the fire down to coals and Mee already awake and sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the east for light. She did not speak when he woke. She just handed him the last of the cornbread and looked back at the horizon. He ate and watched alongside her, and they had their first real silence together. Not the silence of two strangers, not the silence of a man's wall and a woman talking at it, but something new and considerably more complicated. They rode into redemption before noon. Hector Milligan came out of his office at the sound of horses in the street, and when he saw Mae Shepard, he stood very still for a moment with an expression on his broad, weathered face that Edwin had not expected, not just relief, but something close to grief being replaced by gratitude, the specific expression of a man who has prepared himself for the worst and been spared it. "Me," he said. "Thank God." Mee slid off Patience and walked to her uncle, and he put his arms around her shoulders in the awkward, stiff way of a man not accustomed to demonstrating affection, and she patted his arm in the equally awkward way of a woman who is receiving it from someone she does not know well but is grateful for. "I'm sorry I'm late," Mee said. "I had some navigation difficulties." "You're alive," Milligan said. "That's all I care about." He looked up at Edwin over Mee's head. His expression shifted, appraising, acknowledging, settling into the transactional layer that underpinned everything in his world. "Crawford, you found her." "She found me," Edwin said. "I was already found, somewhat against my will, when she arrived." Milligan looked between them with the expression of a man deciding whether to ask for details, and then correctly deciding not to. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you." Inside Milligan's office, over coffee that was genuinely excellent and that Mee received with an expression of pure gratitude that Edwin suspected was entirely sincere, Hector paid Edwin the remaining $100. He also, once Mee had told him about Garrett Pope and the debt and the contract in Colorado, went very quiet for several minutes. "How long before Pope's man arrives?" Milligan said. "The letter was 2 weeks ago," Mee said. "I don't know how long these things take." "We need to deal with this now," Milligan said. He looked at Edwin. "Would you be willing to stay in redemption for a time? I have additional work that could use your particular skills, and if Pope sends someone, I would prefer to have someone capable at hand." Edwin looked at the $100. He looked at his coffee. He looked at me, who was not looking at him, who was looking at her uncle with the expression of someone managing a situation carefully without betraying how much it costs her. "For a reasonable rate," Edwin said. "I'll stay." He did not examine why he said it. He simply said it and then drank his coffee and looked at the window, where the main street of Redemption was going about its Wednesday afternoon business under the deep blue Arizona sky. Milligan arranged a room for Edwin at the hotel, the same four-room affair above the general store. He arranged for me to stay at the house on the edge of town where Milligan's wife, a small, fierce woman named Dorothea who had come from Virginia 15 years ago and had opinions about everything, held absolute domestic authority. Dorothea Milligan had very decided thoughts about me's situation. She shared most of them at volume. She fed me beef stew and biscuits and told her that the best way to deal with men like Garrett Pope was to make herself legally untouchable as quickly as possible, which in the territory of Arizona in 1882 meant primarily one of two things: either having Hector's legal protection formalized in some manner that Pope's lawyers could not work around, or marrying someone. "Dorothea," Hector said. "I am stating facts, Hector," Dorothea said. "A married woman's debts are her husband's debts, and a man like Garrett Pope does not want to tangle with a husband unless the husband is worth less than the debt. He's not a fool, he's a predator, and predators pick what's weakest." Me sat with the stew and thought about this and did not say anything. Over the following days, Edwin Crawford took the measure of Redemption, and Redemption, for the most part, took the measure of Edwin Crawford without being able to get very far with it. He was present in the saloon in the evenings, not drinking heavily, observing. He walked the perimeter of the town. He learned the rhythms of who arrived when, and what they brought, and whether anything about it seemed off. And every morning, around 8 o'clock, Mae Shepard would appear at whatever point of town Edwin happened to be at and say something. It was never demanding. It was never pushy. She did not follow him or seek him out specifically. She went about her own days, helping Dorothea, visiting the general store, writing letters at the small desk in the corner of the Milligan sitting room. But the town was small, and their paths crossed with a regularity that was partly coincidence and partly, Edwin suspected, something she managed without appearing to manage it. She brought him peaches from the general store one morning, a new tin, because she had finished the other one. She set them on the fence post beside where he was looking at the road to the east and said, "In case you need them," and walked on. He ate them. Another morning she appeared while he was having coffee outside the hotel and sat on the step nearby, not next to him, not crowding him, and read a book. After 20 minutes she looked up and said, "Do you read?" "Some," he said. "What?" He thought about it. "History, journals, land journals, exploration. Fremont's reports," he said. "The Army surveys." Mae's face lit up in a way that he had started to notice was specific to certain kinds of information, the way it lit when something connected to something else in her mind. "My father had copies of the Fremont reports," she said. "He used them to plan a trip we never took. We were always going to go west when things calmed down, when his practice could manage without him. We never went." "He died before you got there," Edwin said. "Yes." She looked back at her book, then added quietly, "I am here, though, so in a way we got there eventually. He would have liked Arizona. The light is so clear." Edwin looked at the street. He did not know what to do with the feeling that sentence produced, so he did what he had always done with feelings, set it to one side and turned back to the practical matter at hand. "Have you written to anyone about Pope?" he asked. "A lawyer. Hector has written to his lawyer in Tucson," Mae said. "But Hector's lawyer says Pope's documentation is technically valid, and the only grounds to challenge it would be to argue that my father signed the contract under coercion, which would require witnesses we don't have. Or," Edwin said, "we find something on Pope that makes pursuing you more trouble than it's worth." Mae looked at him carefully. "What kind of something?" "Pope operates in Tucson," Edwin said. "Tucson has a federal marshal's office." If Pope's business operations are not entirely within the law, which, based on what you described about his interests, they are not, then having a marshal ask questions about him at the same time he's trying to enforce a contract against you would complicate his situation considerably. Mee was very still for a moment. You know someone in the federal marshal's office? I've worked with them, Edwin said. Not friends, but they know my work. And you would write on my behalf. He had not thought about it precisely in those terms. He had been thinking about it as a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized, the practical application of available resources. He had not thought about the fact that writing to a federal marshal on someone's behalf was a personal act, a statement of investment, a thing you did for people you were willing to stand behind. He had apparently thought about it as one of those things without noticing he was doing it. Yes, he said. Mee looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Edwin, she said his name. She had not said it before it had been Mr. Crawford or nothing. She said Edwin, and it landed with the same weight as if she had said something much larger, which she was too intelligent to say and too honest to pretend she was not thinking. He sent the letter that afternoon. 3 days later, a man rode into Redemption from the south. He was well dressed by frontier standards, a coat that had been expensive when it was new, a hat with no visible damage, boots with silver toe caps that caught the afternoon light. He asked at the general store for the Milligan house, which confirmed what he was before he had said a word to Milligan himself. His name was Clarence Shore, and he worked for Garrett Pope. Edwin was at the far end of the street when Shore rode in, and he had the man's measure before Shore had dismounted. He watched and waited and let the situation develop, because the one thing you learned tracking men across open country was that patience was not a passive quality. It was a weapon you held until the moment was right. Shore went to the Milligan house. Dorothea Milligan, who had been informed of the possibility of his arrival, told him that Mee was not at home and that he was welcome to leave a message with her husband at the office. Shore went to the office. Hector Milligan received him with the cold, formal courtesy of a man whose money is visible and whose goodwill is clearly conditional. Shore presented the contract. Hector's lawyer, who had come from Tucson that morning, because Hector had arranged this, because Hector was, under the apparent bluster, a man who planned, reviewed the document and asked several pointed questions about the chain of custody and the circumstances of the original loan. Shore was still in the office when Edwin walked in. He did not announce himself. He simply walked in and stood near the door and looked at Clarence Shore, who looked back with the slight bristling of a man who recognizes that the room has changed in a way he has not quite tracked yet. "This is Crawford," Hector said simply. "He works for me." Shore looked at Edwin for several seconds. "Crawford," he said, with a tone of recognition that told Edwin, clearly and immediately, that Pope had done his research. "Sure," Edwin said. "Tell Pope the federal marshal in Tucson received an interesting letter last week about the nature of his business operations. Tell him the marshal is apparently very enthusiastic about following up. Tell him that a man in his position might find that pursuing a contested contract against the niece of Hector Milligan, in front of a territorial lawyer, in a county where I happen to be currently resident, is an expenditure of energy that does not benefit him at the moment." Shore was quiet. He was a smart man. Edwin had assessed that already, and smart men did not mistake the map for the territory. He understood what was being laid in front of him. "The contract is valid," Shore said. "Maybe," Edwin said. "Or maybe the man who originally made the loan did so under terms that the territorial court would find interesting to review. Either way, the time it would take Pope to press the issue, given the current interest of the federal marshal's office in his operations, might be time he prefers to spend on other things." Shore picked up the contract from Hector's lawyer's desk and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll convey the information," he said. "I thought you might," Edwin said. Shore left Redemption 2 hours later, riding south toward Tucson. Edwin watched him go from the street. He turned around and found me standing 10 feet behind him. He had not heard her approach, which was rare enough that he filed it away as evidence of how thoroughly she had begun to occupy the parts of his attention he usually kept clear. "I saw him arrive," she said. "I was watching from the general store. You should have stayed inside." "I know," Mae said. "But I couldn't." She looked at him with a directness that he had learned over the past 10 days, was simply how she looked at things, no performance, no strategy, just the full weight of her attention. "Is it over?" "Probably," Edwin said. "Pope will assess the risk and decide the contract isn't worth what it will cost him right now. He might try again in 6 months when the marshal's attention moves elsewhere. But by then, Hector's lawyer will have filed a challenge to the original document's validity, and it will be tied up in territorial court, which is where these things go to die slowly." Me let out a breath. It was not dramatic. It was the precise breath of a person releasing something they have been holding for a very long time. "Thank you," she said. "That is insufficient as words go, but I mean it completely." "You paid for the job," Edwin said. $40 and some pie," Me said, "which was not proportional to the service provided." "The pie was good," Edwin said. Me laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the real kind, startled out of her, and it changed her face in a way that made him do the thing he had been not doing for 10 days, which was look at her directly. He made himself look away. He walked back toward the hotel. "Edwin," she said. He stopped. "Will you have dinner with us tonight?" "At the house. Dorothea is making roast chicken. It is actually very good." He stood with his back to her and thought about the various ways this was a bad idea and the one way it was not, which was that he wanted to. "Yes," he said. Dorothea Milligan's roast chicken was, as promised, very good. The table was Hector and Dorothea and their elder son, James, who had come down from the range and was 23 and well-intentioned in the harmless way of young men who have never had their intentions tested, and me, and Edwin. Edwin sat at the corner of the table and ate and said very little, and Dorothea talked enough for the entire room, which was a quality he found, surprisingly, restful rather than oppressive. James Milligan looked at me with the admiring attention of someone who has been around cattle for 6 months, and is therefore susceptible to the novelty of a clever woman at the dinner table. Me was kind to him in the way she was kind to everyone genuinely, without condescension, but without encouragement either. She talked to him about Prescott, and asked about the cattle operation, and listened to his answers with real attention. After dinner, when James had gone to the bunkhouse and Hector and Dorothea had retired to the sitting room, me and Edwin sat on the small porch at the back of the house and looked at the dark valley and the stars. "James is going to make someone a good husband," Me said, which confirmed for Edwin that she had noticed his noticing, and that she was telling him something. "He's very young," Edwin said. 23 is not very young," Me said. "I was managing my father's practice at 23. People grow into what they need to." She paused. "I'm talking about him, but I don't think that's what either of us is thinking about." Edwin was quiet. "I want to say something," Me said. "And I want to say it plainly, because I think anything else would waste both our time, and I have already wasted a considerable amount of time on the road here through no fault of my own, and I am not inclined to waste more." He waited. "I like you," Me said. "I like the person I have come to understand you to be over the past 2 weeks. I know that you have a dark past, or at least a complicated one, and I know you have made a practice of keeping people at a distance, and I know I have pushed somewhat against that, and I am not apologizing for it because I think the pushing was correct. But I am also not going to push any further than this." She looked at him, and the starlight was doing interesting things to her face. "I am going to say that I like you, and I am going to let that sit there, and I am not going to demand anything from it, because I think you deserve to decide what to do with it, rather than being herded into something." Edwin looked at the valley. His heart was doing something complicated and unfamiliar, like an animal that has been in a small space for a long time and has just realized the door is open. "You've been talking at me for 2 weeks, he said finally. "Yes," Me said. "I told you I had no use for conversation." You did, Mee said. Your defense, I don't think you believed it entirely even when you said it. I think you had decided conversation was something you couldn't afford, which is different from having no use for it. He was quiet for a long time. The stars were enormous. The valley was dark and still and smelled of sage and cooling earth. My mother died when I was 8, Edwin said. My father was not a good man, not violent, just absent in the way some men are absent even when they're standing right in front of you. I left Kansas at 16 with a horse I'd earned by working a neighbor's farm for 2 summers, and I have been working alone since then mostly because that seemed like the arrangement that cost the least. Mee said nothing. She listened, and the listening was a specific kind, not hungry, not greedy, just open. I have not told many people any of that, Edwin said. I know, Mee said. You are very difficult to not talk to, he said, which was not what he intended to say and was also precisely what he meant. Mee's mouth curved very slightly. I know that too. He looked at her for the first time all evening, really looked, the way he had been carefully not doing. Her eyes in the starlight were the color of deep water. Her hair was coming loose from its pins again, which seemed to be its natural state. She had a small scar at the edge of her left eyebrow that he had not noticed until now, and he had the sudden and unreasonable desire to know the story of it. How did you get that? He said, and touched his own eyebrow to indicate. Mee reached up and touched the scar with one finger reflexively. I was 12, she said. I was trying to reach a book on the top shelf of my father's library and the ladder slipped. The corner of the shelf caught me. My father stitched it himself. He told me the scar would remind me to ask for help when I needed it. Did it work? Mee smiled fully this time. Not particularly, but I remembered the lesson eventually. She looked at him. That's what this is really, coming to redemption, finding my uncle, letting you help me. I am trying to remember the lesson. Edwin looked at his hands. He had Tracker's hands, scarred, practical, permanently marked by rope and weather and years of work that left its evidence on everything it touched. He thought about the lesson she was describing and the parallel version of it, the one he had spent 15 years refusing to learn. I need to check the street, he said. Evening habit. I know, Mee said. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, then stopped without fully meaning to. The scar suits you, he said, which was a thing he had not planned to say. He walked away before he could say anything else, which was, again, purely tactical. But he did not sleep for a long time, and when he did, the things he dreamed about were not the usual ones. The following week was the week that changed things. It began with a letter. It arrived from Tucson in a federal marshal's envelope, addressed to Edwin Crawford at Redemption's post office, and it said that the matter of Garrett Pope's business operations was under active investigation, and that any cooperation from Crawford's source would be appreciated. It was signed by Marshal Delia Forsyth, which was a name Edwin knew and trusted. He brought the letter to Hector Milligan's office and showed it to Hector and the lawyer, a small, dry man named Albright who wore wire spectacles and held his opinions close. Albright read it twice. Pope will know about this within a week, he said. If he was still considering the contract, this will end it. Can we formalize the debt dispute? Edwin asked. I've already filed the petition, Albright said. In Tucson, if Pope retaliates against Miss Shepard in any form while the petition is pending, it constitutes harassment of a party to active litigation. Pope knows this. He's not stupid enough to risk it. Edwin nodded. He felt the particular satisfaction of a solved problem, the clean, squared-off feeling of a thing that has been brought to order. Hector looked at him across the desk with the expression of a man about to change the subject in a significant way. Crawford, he said, what are your plans after this matter is resolved? Move on, Edwin said. There's work in New Mexico. A missing persons matter near Santa Fe. I could use a good man here, Hector said. The Double M has issues that your skills could address on a regular basis. The Canyon Road situation is ongoing. Rourke will push again. I'd rather have someone like you on retainer than scrambling to find help when things develop. Edwin looked at the window. The street outside was just the street, the general store, the post office, the hotel where he had a room, the church at the far end, the ordinary life of a small town proceeding in its ordinary way. "I'll think about it," Edwin said. He walked back to the hotel. Mae was sitting on the steps outside the general store reading, which was where she was most mornings at this hour. She looked up when he passed. "Good news from the marshal's office," he said without stopping. "I saw the envelope," Mae said. "Is it good?" He stopped, turned. "It's over. Pope won't press further." Mae was quiet for a moment. The book in her hands was closed, her finger marking the page. "And you," she said, "what happens now for you?" "Milligan offered me a position," Edwin said. "I know. He told Dorothea and Dorothea told me." She looked at him steadily. "Will you take it?" He looked at her for what felt like a long time but was probably 6 seconds. "I'm thinking," he said. "What are the arguments for and against?" Mae said. "If you want to think out loud, you are welcome to use me as a sounding board." "You already know the arguments," Edwin said. "I do," Mae said, "but I think hearing them in your own words would be useful. For you, I mean." He sat down on the step next to her, which was not something he had planned to do. It was the closest they had been since the ledge through the canyon. "Arguments against," he said. "I have worked alone for 15 years. I know how that works. I know the parameters. I know what I'm responsible for and what I'm not." He stopped. "Arguments for," Mae said quietly. "The work is good," he said. "The town is not terrible. Milligan is a fair employer." He was quiet. "The company is not terrible either." Mae looked at the street. "I am going to stay," she said. "I have decided. Dorothea wants me to help her with the school. Did you know there is a teacher shortage? The woman who was teaching left in April to get married in California, and Dorothea has been managing the school herself, which she does not find compatible with the rest of her commitments. I have taught before. In Prescott, I helped at the school when the teacher was ill. I could do this." She paused. "I want to stay. I want to make something here. I think the town has. I think there's something worth investing in here." "You talk about a town the way other people talk about a project," Edwin said. "I suppose I do," Mae said. "Is that strange?" "No," Edwin said. "It's thorough." She smiled at the street. He looked at the line of her jaw, the slight curve at the corner of her mouth, and said before his practical mind could object, "I'm going to take Milligan's offer." Mae turned to look at him. Her eyes were very clear. "Good," she said simply. "Don't make it larger than it is," he said. "I'm not," she said. "I am just glad." And then, because she was Mae Shepard and could not entirely help it, she added, "And I would like you to know that your company is not terrible to me either. In fact, it is rather considerably better than not terrible, in case that was unclear." "It was not unclear," Edwin said. She smiled again, and he stood up because he had been sitting next to her for 3 minutes and was on the verge of saying something he was not yet ready to say, and some things needed time to arrive on their own terms. He took Milligan's offer the next morning. October came to redemption like a slowly closing hand, beautiful and cold, pressing the last heat out of the days. Mae began teaching school in the first week of October, in the small stone building at the north end of town that served as both the school during the week and the church annex on Sunday. There were 14 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, from the ranching families in the valley and the few town families who had children. Mae taught them reading, arithmetic, geography, and a certain amount of unscheduled natural history, because she found it impossible to stay inside on clear afternoons when the mountains were doing something interesting. Edwin, who was patrolling the canyon road and the valley perimeter and handling Milligan's various tracking and security needs, found himself building his days around certain fixed points without consciously deciding to. One of them was the window of the schoolhouse when he rode past in the mornings. Another was the general store steps at 8. Another was dinner on Thursdays, which had become a standing arrangement with Milligan's household. One Thursday in mid-October after dinner, he and Mae walked back toward the hotel. She was still staying at the Milligan house, but the hotel was roughly in between, and he said, without particular preamble, "I want to tell you about Laredo." Mae looked at him sideways. "You said I shouldn't ask." "I'm not asking you to ask," he said. "I'm telling you." "There's a difference." There is, she agreed. I'm listening. Laredo, he said, was 4 years ago. He had been hired by a man named Tobias Angel to track a man who had allegedly stolen land deeds from Angel's family. He had found the man. His name was Harlow, a thin, nervous man with a family in a small town outside Laredo, and brought back evidence of his location. Angel had sent 3 men to Harlow's house. 2 of the men Angel sent were not the kind of men you sent when you intended to simply retrieve documents. They were the kind you sent when you intended violence. Harlow had died. His wife and 2 children had been in the house. The wife had survived. The children had not been harmed. But the man had died, and Edwin had been the one who found him, and he had not known what Angel intended when he took the job, but afterward it had not mattered whether he had known. The sheriff in Laredo decided I was complicit, Edwin said. I was not in the legal sense, but I was in the sense that I put a man in front of people who wanted to kill him. Me walked beside him in the quiet street. And Angel moved to Denver, Edwin said. Has a house there. Has no consequences for any of it. That is a profound injustice, Me said. Yes, Edwin said, that's what it is. And you have been carrying it since. Yes. You could not have known what he intended, Me said. No, Edwin said, but I took the money. And after that I was very careful about who I worked for, which is why Hector's letter was something I looked at closely before I accepted. And it is why the federal marshal's office knows my work, because after Laredo I worked exclusively on legitimate cases under people I could verify. You changed, Me said. I tried to, he said. Whether that's worth anything is a separate question. It is worth a great deal, Me said. It's worth everything, actually. Knowing something was wrong and changing yourself in response to it is the hardest thing people do, and most of them don't do it. She paused. I think your father was wrong to be absent. I think the people who misused your work were wrong. And I think you have spent a very long time paying for other people's failures. She looked at him. You don't owe any more of that. Edwin stopped walking. They were at the intersection in the middle of town, under the light from the saloon window across the street, and the night was cold and clear and enormous. Me, he said. Yes, she said, and her voice was very steady. I have been thinking about what you said, he said. On the porch, that you like me. I remember saying that, she said. I am not, he started and stopped. I have not done this, any of this, I don't know how. I know, Me said. I have noticed. That doesn't discourage you. It makes me more interested, if I'm honest, Me said, because I think what's underneath the not knowing how is something worth knowing. I think you are a person worth being known. She looked at him with complete directness. And I would like to know you, Edwin, all of it. The parts you've already told me and the parts you haven't. I am not in a hurry. I am staying in redemption. And I believe you are staying in redemption. And that gives us a reasonable amount of time to proceed carefully. He looked at her face in the saloon light, the scar at her eyebrow, the steady creek-water eyes, the small, serious line of her mouth that became something extraordinary when she smiled. Could I take you to dinner, he said. Not at Milligan's, at the hotel, the dining room. Me blinked. Saturday, he said. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. She walked on toward the Milligan house. He stood at the intersection until she had gone around the corner. And then he looked up at the sky, which was, as she had said once when this all began, really something. The dinner on Saturday was the best meal Edwin Crawford had eaten in years, and not because the food was particularly remarkable. The hotel dining room produced a creditable beef and potato dish, and a pie that was good but not exceptional. But because Me wore a green dress he had not seen before, and she had done something with her hair that suggested considerable effort. And she looked at him across the small table with such uncomplicated gladness that something in his chest that had been closed for a very long time opened up without ceremony and simply stayed open. They talked for 3 hours. He said as much as she did, which was something he could not have predicted 2 weeks ago. He told her about tracking work he had done in New Mexico, about the landscapes he had moved through, the different quality of light in different territories. She told him about her father's practice, the patients he had treated, The way a doctor's household collected stories, the way other households collected furniture. She told him about a patient her father had, an old Apache woman who had come to him for treatment of an injury and had brought payment in turquoise beads, and a jar of something medicinal that Dr. Shepard had never been able to identify but that had worked. He kept the jar, Mae said, right up until he died. He said it was a reminder that healing came in forms he didn't understand. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Edwin said. He was, Mae said, simply and without performance. I think you would have liked each other. You're both people who keep things, but not unnecessarily, just the things that matter. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, which was not something he had planned. His hand was considerably larger than hers and bore all the evidence of his particular life, and hers was warm and still under his, not pulling away, not gripping back, just present. I think, Edwin said, that I have been not talking for 15 years because I was convinced there was no one worth talking to. Mae turned her hand over under his, gently, so their palms were together. And now, she said, and now I think I was wrong, he said. I think I was protecting something that didn't need protecting, or protecting it the wrong way. He looked at her. I don't know yet what this is, but I know I want to find out. So do I, Mae said. That's all it has to be right now. He walked her home in the cold October night and said good night at the Milligan gate. And when he walked back to the hotel, the stars were there above him the way they always were. But he was aware of them differently. The way you are aware of ordinary things when someone has pointed out that they are extraordinary and turned out to be right. November came with its own demands. Dylan Rourke, emboldened by the territorial court's delay in ruling on the canyon land deed, began pushing harder. 2 ranching families in the valley found their cattle driven off course by men they could not identify, but who knew the valley terrain in a way that pointed clearly to Rourke's operation. Edwin tracked the cattle both times and returned them, and documented what he found in a written report that Hector sent to the territorial court. The canyon land deed case went to decision in late November. The court ruled that Rourke's deed was valid but that his use of it to obstruct public transit was not, and issued an injunction against the toll collection. Rourke's men were off the canyon road by December 1st. It was not everything. Rourke was not in jail. The deed still existed. But the immediate threat was addressed, and the valley road was open. And when Edwin rode the canyon passage for the first time without needing to use the hidden ledge route, he thought about the morning he had taken Mae through it, her silence on the narrow ledge, her one quiet breath on the other side. He thought about her constantly now, which was a new experience and one he was slowly becoming comfortable with. He went to the schoolhouse one afternoon in late November and stood in the doorway while she was finishing the day's lessons. He watched her with the 14 children. She was teaching the older ones about the territory's geography, tracing the river systems on a paper map pinned to the wall, explaining why the rivers ran the way they did and what that meant for where towns grew. She was not performing the teaching. She was genuinely interested in what she was explaining, and the interest was contagious. Even the 12-year-old Brody boy, who had a reputation for not paying attention, was watching the map with something approaching focus. When the children left, she turned and saw Edwin in the doorway and smiled. "You came to visit," she said. "I was passing," he said. "You were not passing," she said. "The school is at the north end of town. Nothing you need to check is at the north end of town unless you specifically come here." He came in and looked at the map on the wall. "You're teaching them the rivers," he said. "Rivers are everything," Mae said, rolling the map carefully. "Where the water is, that's where the life is. That's where people will go, where towns will grow, where the future will be. If you can read the rivers, you can understand the country." Edwin looked at her rolling the map with the practiced care she brought to everything that mattered. "Marry me," he said. Mae stopped rolling the map. She turned and looked at him with her full attention, which was, as he had learned, formidable. "Edwin Crawford," she said. "I know it's abrupt," he said. "You don't have to answer now." I'll answer now," she said. She set the map down and walked toward him, and he stood very still in the way he had been still in the saloon with Cassius Vole's gun at his temple, except that this was absolutely nothing like that, except perhaps in the sense of his entire future tilting on a single moment. "Yes," Mae said, "I will marry you." She took his face between her hands, which no one had ever done, and looked at him for a long moment as though confirming something. Then she stood on her toes and kissed him briefly and precisely, like a sentence that ends exactly where it should. "I have been waiting for that to happen," she said, dropping back to her heels. "Not the proposal specifically, but for you to stop being afraid of wanting something." "I wasn't afraid," Edwin said. "You were a little afraid," Mae said, "and that's all right." "You are the most impossible woman," he said. "I know," she said happily. "Are you sure you want to marry me?" "I have never been more certain of anything," he said, which was true, and which arrived without the hesitation he would have predicted if you had asked him, 3 months ago, whether he would ever say something like that. They were married on the second Saturday of December 1882 in the stone church at the south end of Redemption, by the minister who came every other Sunday and had been persuaded to make a special trip. Dorothea Milligan organized the arrangements with her characteristic efficiency and had opinions about flowers, seating, and the appropriate length of the ceremony. Hector Milligan stood beside me and gave her hand to Edwin with the look of a man who has done an unexpectedly right thing and knows it. The church was full, because Redemption was small enough that a wedding was a community event regardless of whether the participants were long-established residents or relative newcomers. James Milligan, in the front row, wore an expression of mild romantic defeat that he recovered from quickly and with good grace. The 14 schoolchildren were in the third row and were very well behaved except for the Brody boy, who whispered throughout but quietly enough not to cause a problem. Edwin stood at the front of the church and watched me walk toward him, and she was wearing the green dress from their first dinner, and her hair was done with obvious effort, and she was looking at him with the expression she had when something clicked into place in her mind, calm and certain, and genuinely delighted. He thought about the moment he had said, with full conviction, that he had no use for conversation. He thought about the 3 hours behind the livery stable in Copper Flat, and the canyon road in the early morning, and the peaches in the tin, and her voice in the dark asking him where he was from. He thought about 15 years of alone and all the small ways it had cost him, and the way she had talked at him and beside him and through him until the wall he had built stopped being a protection and started being just a wall he could choose to open or not. He had chosen to open it. She had talked until he forgot he had ever meant to keep it closed. The minister said the words. Edwin said his. Mae said hers, clearly and without hesitation, looking directly at him. They walked out of the church into December sunshine that was thin and clear and cold and beautiful, and someone had tied tin cans to the back of a wagon as a joke, and Dorothea Milligan was deeply offended by this and Hector found it hilarious, and Mae laughed at both of them, and Edwin stood in the middle of all of it and felt, for the first time since he was a child, that he was standing in a place that belonged to him. They settled into the life of redemption, the way water settles into a landscape, finding the natural channels, shaping and being shaped. Edwin continued his work for Milligan, which now included formal training of 2 of the younger ranch hands in tracking and trail reading. Mae continued the school, and in January, when the population of children went up by 2 due to a new family settling in the valley, she wrote to the Territorial Education Office requesting formal supplies and received, 3 weeks later, a box of books that the children greeted with the mixed enthusiasm of people who both want to learn and find the prospect slightly threatening. They had a house, a small adobe on the western edge of town that Hector had purchased and offered at reasonable rent until it could be bought outright, which Edwin intended to manage by spring. It had a front room and a kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a porch that faced west, which meant they saw the sunsets over the ridge in the evenings, the long orange and red light that spread across the valley like something spilled. Mae put books in every room. Edwin put nothing anywhere that did not serve a purpose, except for one thing, the tin of peaches, empty and cleaned, that sat on the windowsill in the kitchen. Me had seen him put it there and had not said a word, which was the most enormous kindness, and he had loved her for it in the very specific way you love someone for knowing exactly when not to say the right thing. They talked in the evenings. This was the thing he had never done, the thing he had believed he was built wrong for. They sat on the porch in their coats in December and January, watching the ridge turn dark, and talked about the day, and about the things they had read, and about the past, piece by piece, the way you move through a room that has been closed for a long time, carefully taking stock of what is there without trying to move everything at once. He told her more about Kansas. She told him more about her father. He told her about 3 or 4 other jobs that had gone wrong in various ways. She told him about the 2 men who had attempted to court her in Prescott and why it had not worked, which was primarily that neither of them could hold an interesting conversation for longer than 20 minutes. "Is that your criterion?" he said. "Interesting conversation." "Among others," me said. "But it correlates strongly with the other things I care about. People who are interested in the world. People who pay attention. People who don't assume they already know what they need to know." She looked at him in the cold evening air. "You pay attention very carefully to everything, Edwin. That is one of the first things I noticed about you." "I'm a tracker," he said. "It's the job." "It's not just the job," she said. "You pay attention to people. You noticed the Brody boy was listening in the school that day before I did." "He was trying not to show it," Edwin said. "People who are trying not to show they're interested are often the most interested." Me looked at him with the full weight of that expression. "Yes," she said, "they are." He took her hand in his, their now familiar configuration on the porch in the evenings, and they watched the ridge go dark in its slow and beautiful way. February brought snow, which was rare enough in the valley that it was something to remark on. The children at the school were beside themselves with it, and me had the profound pedagogical flexibility to abandon the planned lesson in favor of going outside and looking at it. She sent Edwin a note, via the Brody boy, who was delighted to have a legitimate reason to run across town during school hours, saying, "There is snow. I am taking the children outside. Come look if you have a moment." He came and looked. She was standing in the snow in the schoolyard with 14 children throwing it at each other, her arms out at her sides like someone receiving something, her face turned up to the sky, the flakes settling in her hair and on her green coat. She heard him at the gate and looked down and grinned at him, the full, unguarded grin that she had in moments like this, nothing held back. He stood at the gate and watched, and thought about his criterion for things worth having, which had been, for 15 years, primarily functional usefulness, cleanliness, avoidance of cost, and how that was not wrong exactly, but was incomplete in a way he was only now understanding. Like a map that shows the roads but not the rivers. You could travel by it. You just couldn't understand the country. In March, me told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen while she was making coffee, very directly and without preamble, which was entirely consistent with everything she had ever done. Edwin put down his cup and looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said, which was not what he intended to say first but came out ahead of everything else. "Very well," she said. "The doctor in town says everything looks as it should, which is a limited assessment given that doctor. Warren is primarily focused on livestock, but he did have a mother and presumably a reasonable understanding of the general process." Edwin crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, which was something he had been slowly learning, the vocabulary of physical tenderness, the thing he had gone so long without that it had felt like a language he had never spoken. She leaned into him and put her head against his shoulder, and for a moment they just stood in the kitchen while the coffee made its noises on the stove. "Edwin," she said against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "You're going to be a very good father," she said. "I know you are worried about that." Had not said he was worried about that. "I had a difficult father," he said. "You are not your father," she said. You have never been your father. You left at 16 because you already knew the difference between what you had and what was right. He held her more carefully. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the beginning of March coming through the window, and outside the valley was starting to show green at the edges where winter was releasing its grip. A boy or a girl, he said. Either is fine. Either is wonderful, Mae said. We will find out when we find out. He kissed the top of her head, which still smelled faintly of the snow from February even though that was 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was just her. Word from the federal marshal's office arrived in late March, in a letter to Edwin from Marshal Forsyth. Garrett Pope had been indicted on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy in connection with his business operations. He had retained lawyers and would likely not be convicted of everything, but the immediate legal situation made any attempt to enforce outstanding contracts against debtors distinctly problematic. Pope was, functionally, done as a threat. Edwin brought the letter home and set it on the table in front of me, who read it twice and then sat very quietly for a moment. "It's over," she said. "Completely," Edwin said. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and he could see her doing the thing she did when emotions were arriving in a size that required management not suppressing them, just receiving them in order. Then she looked up at him. "My father's debt," she said. "Even if the contract is unenforceable, the debt is real. He borrowed the money." "Yes," Edwin said. "I want to pay it back," she said. "Not to Pope, to whatever legitimate account holds it. I know it will take time. I know it is more than we have right now, but I want to." "We'll pay it back," Edwin said. It was that simple to him, a thing she wanted to do, so they would do it. The money would come over time. He had learned to earn it and she had learned to manage it, and together they would manage it. Mae looked at him. "You didn't even hesitate," she said. "No," he said. $1,100 is a considerable amount of money, Edwin." "Yes," he said. "We have time." She reached across the table and held his hand the way she always held it, palm to palm, full contact, nothing performative about it. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time. She had said it 3 times before in different moments. He had said it back, each time with increasing certainty, the way you improve at a language the more you speak it. "I love you," he said. "Also, your coffee is going to go cold." She laughed, the real one, startled out of her, and let go of his hand and picked up her cup. Summer arrived, and with it the full heat of the Arizona Valley, and Mae taught school through June, and then stopped for the summer term and spent the long days in the cooler hours of morning and evening writing letters. To the Territorial Education Office about supplies, to a former colleague of her father's who was interested in establishing a proper medical practice in the valley, to various people she had corresponded with about the state of the roads, the state of the territory, the various practical problems of a small town trying to become something more than temporary. Edwin watched her write letters the way he watched her teach, with the specific quality of attention he had learned to apply to things that mattered. She was building something here. It was not the grand ambition of someone who wanted recognition. It was the thoroughgoing ambition of someone who wanted the place they lived to be genuinely good, for the people in it, present and future. He was building it with her. That was what he had not understood when Milligan offered him the position, what staying in Redemption actually meant. Not just work, not just a town, the actual construction, piece by piece, of a life that was shared. The baby arrived in October, 13 months after Edwin and Mae had ridden into Redemption together on a bright September morning. It was a boy, which delighted Edwin in a way he had not anticipated being delighted by anything, and he was born without significant complication under the care of Dr. Patterson, who had arrived in August in response to Mae's letters and turned out to be an excellent physician by any standard. They named him Thomas for Mae's father. Edwin held Thomas in the morning light of their bedroom while Mae slept. She had been awake for most of the night and needed rest, and he looked at this small, extraordinary person with the feeling that he imagined explorers had when they came over a ridge and saw, laid out before them, a country they had known existed but had never seen. Vast and overwhelming and entirely real. Thomas opened his eyes, which were dark and unfocused in the way of new babies, and looked in the general direction of Edwin's face. "Hello," Edwin said quietly. "I'm your father. I'm not going to be absent. I want you to know that. I'm going to pay attention." Thomas made a small sound that was not agreement or disagreement and closed his eyes again. Edwin sat with him and watched the Arizona morning come through the window, gold and clear, and heard me stir behind him, and turned to find her watching him. "You're talking to him," she said softly, with the smile that was everything. "He's worth talking to," Edwin said. Me made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that was not, and held out her arms, and he brought Thomas to her, and the three of them were in the morning light together in the house that was theirs on the edge of the valley in Redemption, Arizona. The year turned. Thomas grew with the velocity of babies, from the impossible smallness of October to a creature of curious motion and persistent opinion by the following spring. He was, from very early, loud, not unhappy, just communicative, convinced that whatever he was experiencing was worth announcing. Me found this hilarious, and Edwin found it, inexplicably, exactly what he had expected. "He gets it from you," Edwin said one afternoon, when Thomas had spent 20 minutes providing a running commentary on a beetle he had found on the porch. "He absolutely does not get it from me," Me said. "You narrate your own experiences," Edwin said, "constantly." "I think out loud," Me said. "There is a difference." "Thomas thinks out loud," Edwin said. Me looked at her son, who had moved on from the beetle to investigating a gap in the porch boards with full scholarly concentration, and said, "You may have a point." The summer of 1883 brought several significant things. The territorial court finalized the ruling against Rourke, and Dylan Rourke, faced with a mounting legal bill and a canyon road he could no longer monetize, sold his deed to a consortium of valley ranchers including Hector Milligan and left the territory. Edwin had one final piece of tracking work connected to Rourke, a matter of some cattle that had gone missing from the eastern range, and that turned out to have been moved by one of Rourke's former men who had not gotten the message about the court ruling. Edwin found the cattle and found the man and turned both over to the proper authorities, and that was the end of Dylan Rourke's presence in the valley. Marshal Forsyth sent a letter in July informing Edwin that Garrett Pope had taken a plea arrangement that included the dissolution of his outstanding contract portfolio. The debt that Thomas Shepard had owed, now transferred to the official record as formally disputed, and in the process of being discharged by his daughter, would be settled by the end of the year. Me wrote back to Forsyth directly, thanking her, and received a reply that surprised her. Forsyth said, among other things, that Edwin Crawford was one of the most reliable sources of information her office had worked with in the territory, and that the work he had done in directing her attention to Pope's operations had been consequential. Me brought this letter to the kitchen table where Edwin was eating breakfast and set it in front of him without comment. He read it. He set it down. "She didn't have to say that," he said. "No," Me said. "She said it because it's true." She sat across from him. "You have done a great deal of good in this world, Edwin. I know you carry the things that went wrong. I know about Laredo and the other things you've told me, but the ledger has more than one column in it." He looked at her over his coffee cup. This was the woman who had walked into a saloon with a gun at a man's head and said, "Oh good, you found him." Who had talked at him for 3 hours behind a livery stable until he sat down on a feed trough and started listening to himself think. Who had said, very plainly, that she liked him, and waited for him to decide what to do with it. "You are," he said, "the best thing that has ever happened to me." Me's expression did the thing it did in moments like this, not looking away, not deflecting, just receiving it. "The feeling," she said, "is entirely mutual." Autumn of 1883 returned to Redemption with its cool perfection, and Me returned to school with 21 children this time. because the valley was growing two new families from Texas, one from New Mexico, a family of Czech immigrants who had come west from Kansas and whose children learned English fast and whose parents came to me, outside of school hours, asking if she could help them too. She did. She added an evening class on Tuesdays for adults who needed English, and it grew until it had 12 regular attendees. Thomas, who was walking by now in the unsteady but determined way of one-year-olds who have decided that mobility is the most important issue in their lives, frequently came to school with me in a basket that sat at the front of the room, and provided a useful educational resource for the younger children, who were learning about babies in the pragmatic, empirical way that children learn about most things. Edwin, riding his patrol of the valley on a Tuesday afternoon in October, stopped his horse at the top of the ridge above Redemption and looked down at the town. From this height he could see the church, the general store, the hotel, the saloon, the school with its one window lit orange from the lamps inside for the evening class, the adobe on the western edge with the porch that faced the sunset. He had looked at many landscapes in his life, tracking people through them, moving through them alone with a purpose and then moving on. He had never looked at one and thought, "That is mine," not in the possessive way, in the belonging way. The way a person belongs to a place, not the other way around. He rode down and tied his horse at the post and walked inside, and me was in the kitchen feeding Thomas mashed potato, and a running commentary on the historical origins of the potato that Thomas was receiving with the philosophical acceptance of someone who understood that information was coming regardless of their level of interest. And Edwin took off his coat and hat and sat down at the table and said, "How was the class tonight?" "Mrs. Novick made progress with the past tense," me said. "She has been struggling with it. The Czech language handles time differently from English, and the translation creates confusion. But tonight something clicked for her. I could see it in her face. That look when a thing finally makes sense." She handed Thomas another spoonful of potato, which he accepted with gravity. "Mr. Horrocks has a remarkable memory. Once he hears a word in the right context, he retains it entirely." "You enjoy the evening class," Edwin said. "I enjoy all of it," me said. "But the evening class has something the children's school does not, which is that the people choosing to be there have already decided they want to learn, which removes a certain amount of convincing." She looked at him. "How was the ridge?" "Clear," he said. "Cold. I looked at the town from above." "And," she said, "it looked like home," he said. Me's expression settled into something that was not quite a smile and was considerably more than one, the expression she had when she received information that confirmed something she had believed and is glad to have confirmed. "Yes," she said, "it does." Thomas, having finished the potato, reached his small hand across the table toward Edwin with the focused determination of someone who has identified a target and is not going to be deterred. Edwin took the hand, impossibly small, utterly serious, and Thomas examined his father's fingers with the scientific interest he brought to beetles and porch boards and everything else in his expanding world. "He is exactly like you," me said. "He approaches everything like a problem to be tracked. He approaches everything like it is deeply interesting," Edwin said. "Which is how you approach things," me said, "when you're not pretending you have no interest in anything." "I have never pretended that," Edwin said. "The first thing you ever said to me," me reminded him, "was that you had no use for conversation." "I was," Edwin said very carefully, "mistaken about that." Me grinned. "I know," she said. "I knew it then." "You couldn't possibly have known it then," he said. "You had just met me." "I knew it when you said yes to being my husband before I had finished explaining why it would be helpful," me said. "No man with no use for connection does that. You were performing the indifference. I could see the actual you behind it quite clearly." He looked at her across the table where Thomas was still investigating his fingers. He thought about the saloon, about the gun, about the word yes that had come out before he had quite decided. He thought about 3 hours behind a livery stable and an overturned feed trough and 8 words spoken, because the silence had stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a room. "You are insufferably perceptive," he said. "Yes," Mae said. "It's one of my better qualities." She picked up Thomas and held him against her shoulder, and Thomas made the sound he made when he was satisfied with the state of things, which was a low, contented sound that he had been making since he was 3 weeks old. "We're going to need a second bedroom," Mae said, very casually, looking at the ceiling. Edwin looked at her. "We have 2 bedrooms. Thomas has one," Mae said, "and we have one." She looked at him sideways with the particular expression she had when she was delivering information she knows will require a moment to process. "And we will need a third." The moment required a moment. "Me," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I am saying," Mae said, "that Dr. Patterson confirms it, and that Thomas is going to be a very responsible older brother, because he has already demonstrated the character for it by being generally benevolent toward the Brody boy, who is significantly larger than him and somewhat overbearing." Edwin stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and Thomas together, which was somewhat complicated geometrically, but entirely worth it. And Mae laughed into his shoulder, and Thomas made his contented sound between them. They built the addition to the house in the spring of 1884, with help from James Milligan and 2 of the ranch hands who turned out to have construction experience. Hector donated the lumber, which was Hector's way of expressing affection, materially without comment, assuming no gratitude would be explicitly offered or required. Dorothea supervised the construction with opinions that improved it considerably. The second baby arrived in June, another boy, whom they named after no one in particular and called Arthur, which was a name Mae had liked since childhood because of a book her father had given her, and which Edwin found solid in a way he approved of. Arthur was considerably quieter than Thomas, but watched everything with enormous dark eyes that tracked movement the way his father tracked everything, with complete attention and no visible reaction, storing information for later use. "He will be a mystery to everyone," Mae said, looking at Arthur at 3 months old. "Good," Edwin said. They stood, the 4 of them, on the porch that faced the sunset on a June evening when the sky was doing everything it knew how to do in gold and orange and deep blue at the edges, and redemption was below them in the valley, and the ridge was dark above them. And Thomas was standing at the porch rail saying something long and detailed about a bird he could see, and Arthur was in Mae's arms watching the bird with great seriousness. Edwin put his arm around Mae's shoulders and she leaned into him, familiar and complete, and they watched the sky do its work. He thought about the road to Copper Flat, the dust. The moment she had walked through the saloon doors and changed everything by being exactly who she was, the kind of person who says the preposterous thing at exactly the right moment, who talks because thinking is a physical act that needs somewhere to go, who listened to a man say he had no use for conversation, and looked at him with those creekwater eyes and said, in the plainest possible way, that she did not think that was exactly true. She had been right. She had been right about all of it. The indifference that was not really indifference, the wall that was not a permanent structure but a choice, the loneliness that was a cost he had decided to pay and which he no longer had to pay. She had talked until he forgot he had said it, and then she had given him something better than the silence he had built, not conversation for its own sake, but the real thing that conversation was a door to. The thing where someone knows you fully, and you know them, and the knowing is not a vulnerability but the foundation of something that holds. Thomas finished his report on the bird and turned around and walked to his father with the assurance of a 2-year-old, who has never had reason to doubt that his father's attention is available. Edwin picked him up and held him against his side, and Thomas grabbed his collar and looked out at the valley with the expression of someone surveying a territory he intends to understand completely. "Bird," Thomas said, pointing at where the bird had been. "Gone," Edwin said. "It flew east." Thomas considered this. "Come back?" he asked. "Probably," Edwin said. "Things that belong somewhere usually do." Mae looked at him with the full weight of her attention, the way she had looked at him since the beginning, seeing everything. "Yes," she said softly, "they do." The valley settled into evening around them, the long, slow dark of an Arizona summer night coming up from the east while the west still held its light, and the four of them were on the porch of the house that was theirs in the town that was theirs, and the stars were beginning, one by one, to arrive above the ridge. And Edwin Crawford, who had once told a woman he had no use for conversation, said nothing at all. He did not need to. Everything that mattered was already said, already known, already held between them in the particular and permanent way of things that have been built carefully, from scratch, by two people who decided, one of them somewhat later than the other, but no less certainly, that the cost of being known was worth every single thing it asked.